Okay, we're going to look very quickly at this one instance of syntax being repeated in the I Have a Dream speech. So the sentence says, 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still badly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. Now, we don't see repetition of words, of diction in this, except for maybe the word of, but that's not really significant enough to talk about anaphora or epistrophe or diacope or any of those Latin terms associated with repetition. What we see instead is a repetition of parts of speech. So we see manacles of segregation and chains of discrimination. I've written it right here. So you have a noun, a preposition, and another noun to create a noun phrase, and then it repeats that noun phrase again. Now, in order to write about syntax and repetition of syntax, you really do need to know your parts of speech. And that can be as basic as knowing your nouns, your prepositions, adverbs, adjectives, and verbs. You don't have to get into, the really nitty gritty of grammar. If you just said it was a repetition of noun phrases, then you would probably be just fine. But here you look at how this is repeated and how it creates this close association between the two phrases. So to illustrate that, I've made a little table. Okay, so we've got manacles of segregation versus chains of discrimination. And so this creates, if you look up here, it creates an association between the two phrases, but what happens is it also creates an association between the different parts of speech that are being repeated. So we get an association down the table like this in the columns. We get manacles and chains being associated together. Now that's very significant when you are talking about civil rights, right? Because you're not only talking then about these two things in an abstract way, which up here it seems abstract, manacles of segregation, chains of discrimination, that's meant as a metaphor, right? Segregation doesn't literally manacle somebody, but then you look here and you separate that out and you see, oh, this might be significant in terms of civil rights. You can think about manacles and chains in terms of slavery. These are going to be images that are especially relevant to the audience and subject that he's addressing. And you can also think about manacles and chains in terms of imprisonment. In the 1960s, we had, to be political, similar problems to today, where a large percentage of prison populations was made up of African Americans, and this was sort of like a continuation of slavery into the 60s, and so these manacles and chains then have that double meaning there. So it's not only then meant figuratively, right? It's also meant literally, and we can see that literal association when we put the two things together and think about how they relate to each other. Of signifies that one belongs to the other. So manacles belong to segregation. Chains belong to discrimination. And this is really important because when we get here and we make this association between segregation and discrimination, you get to his political point. Many people in the 1960s were arguing that segregation is not a form of discrimination. You have probably heard the phrase separate but equal, right? So the opponents of integration, the segregationists, they I don't know if they believed, but their arguments usually centered around the fact that segregation was not discriminatory. Very few people were going before Congress and arguing, yeah, it's discriminatory and that's great because this race of people is inferior to another race of people. They'd kind of gone beyond that in the rhetoric, and even though that's the implication of the argument, few people were saying that directly. Instead, they were saying keep races segregated, but with equal treatment, and this is going to be better for everybody, right? So then by phrasing it this way and connecting these two words, segregation, discrimination, he is saying that both of these things work to manacle and chain. And so segregation then leads to discrimination. And you can think of the ofs, if you put an of between segregation and discrimination, the discrimination of segregation, then you understand how these things all belong to each other. So he's using a repetition of syntax here to associate these two ideas very closely in our minds. He doesn't up here say segregation is discrimination. Instead, he can just sort of imply this very cleverly and using much more interesting language and imagery.